Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at how to use the active OC tuner feature that Gigabyte has added to their X570 to some of their new X570 boards. So they've added this to the X570 Extreme Revision 2, the X570S Aorus Master, which is the board that I'm using here, and the X570S Aorus Pro AX. Yeah, I'm on the master here with a 5950X and a 280mm AIO. And here we are on the default BIOS screen, so this is what you get when you first boot the board. And so let's go into advanced mode, which you get there by hitting the F2 key. And the first thing we're going to do is, for comparison's sake, we're going to run like a basic PBO setup against the active OC tuner. So the actual active OC tuner is all the way down here in the advanced CPU settings tab. And for now, we're not going to enable it because, again, we're going to compare it against PBO. So we're going to enable our XMP profile. So I'm on a G.Skill 2x16 Samsung B-die based dual rank 3600 CL14 kit, which is basically about as high performance as it gets for like a easy to run XMP profile. There are faster profiles than this out there. Like there's faster XMP specs than this, but they're not real. Like they're very likely to run into stability. Like they're far more likely to run into stability issues than 3600 CL14 is. Anyway, yeah, now for PBO. So there's two locations where you can find Precision Boost Overdrive in the Gigabyte BIOS. There's this one, which for whatever reason hasn't been working for me properly. So instead we're going to use the other one, which is down here in the AMD overclocking menu. And we're just going to set that to advance. PBO limits to manual, because the motherboard limits are actually slower than the manual settings that I'm going to use for Cinebench specifically. One of the sort of annoying things with PBO is that you can tune the TDC and EDC limits for different workloads to a lesser or greater extent. So like settings that are best for Cinebench performance aren't necessarily the best for, say, Linpack performance. Yeah, that's just sort of a thing that PBO does. And depending on sort of what you care more about, you can adjust the limits, but that's not what this video is about today. And we are testing with Cinebench, so we're going to use settings that are, in my experience, sort of optimal for Cinebench. The scaler, we're just going to leave it at 1x. We're not going to mess with the curve optimizer, and we're going to set the max CPU boost clock override to 100 megahertz because that I just know that works. Also, we don't really need that for this test right here, but yeah, we'll just turn that on. Anyway, so that's the basic PBO setup. Also, I'm going to max out all my fan speeds because this is a test bench. I don't really care about the noise. And that's all of them ramped up. And now it's time to run some Cinebench R20. Now I'm using R20 because I'm used to using R20, and also it's short. So, yeah. Also, after a okay, so this is fine. If you clear CMOS, the first boot on this motherboard will be like a double boot. Like it'll boot up once and then it'll reset itself and boot a second time. But I didn't clear CMOS between takes of this video, so yeah, it didn't do that. So there's our Cinebench. I'm just gonna, well, actually we should pull up hardware info. The thing is, I had one take where for whatever reason Cinebench was like 100 points slower than it should be. And then I restarted the system and it was running correctly again, so I don't know what was up with that. Anyway. So, as you can see, we're hitting around sort of 4.4 gigahertz on the CPU cores. Hitting also around 81 degrees Celsius on the CPU temperature at around 1.24, 1.25 volts. And this should produce around 11,400 points. I've seen it do 11,408. I've also seen it do 11, like this, yes. So this is the score it was supposed to produce. So 11,402 points is the score we got. And now we're going to switch over to the active OC tuner, and we're going to just, like, beat that score. Not by a huge margin, because the thing is, PBO isn't 100% efficient when it comes to like matching the voltage to the clocks, which is why the curve optimizer exists. But all the curve optimizer really lets you do is reduce the power consumption. And it does give you a little bit more performance as well in the process, but it's not quite the same as just running a static overclock. Which is what the active OC tuner allows you to do, is basically it allows you to have PBO for your low current workloads, and low load workloads are like games, and well, I'm not really sure of any other low current workloads that would justify having boost. Like, a lot of people will say, like, oh, I need boost for, like, loading web pages, and I'm like, it's a freaking web page, guys. Like, it's... I don't think you'll notice the difference between loading a web page at 4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz. But anyway, let's turn on the active OC tuner. So we have these two settings here, the CPU current limit and the CPU temperature limit. These are both trigger points for the active OC tuner, so we're just going to set that temperature limit to like 95 degrees Celsius. And the current limit, we're actually going to set it to, say, 100 amps. And so basically, when the CPU runs a workload that pulls over 100 amps, it's going to switch over to our active OC tuner settings rather than running regular PBO. And the idea behind this is that we can run more frequency. And so Cinebench pulls around 140-ish amps on PBO. Actually, maybe more than that, but it pulls more than 100 amps. And so on a 5950X, if you have a lower core count CPU, it pulls less current. So you'll have to set this setting accordingly. But on a 5950X, if we set it to 100, it'll, like, all core Cinebench will actually just sort of run on the active OC tuner settings. So we set that to 100. Then next we're going to set our CPU ratio mode to per CCX. We're going to put 46.5 on the first CCX and then 45.5 on the second one, because the second CCD, this is a 5950X, it has two CCDs, the second CCD kind of sucks, which is the norm. Like, that's kind of the whole, greatest benefit to AMD with chiplets is they can give you one good piece of silicon and one not so great piece of silicon. So that's exactly what's going on with the two chiplets here. Anyway, now instead of setting your voltage over here, which you might be tempted to do that, don't do that. Like, the problem, if you try to use this voltage setting for your voltage, it'll be horribly unstable, because that is an override voltage that'll apply to the CPU at all times. And the boost system needs a lot of voltage, right? When your 5950X boosts up to 5 gigahertz, it's probably using around 1.45 to 1.48 volts to do that. If you punch in like 1.3 volts here, it'll crash the moment it tries to boost to 5 gigahertz. So don't do that. Anyway, so instead, for voltage control, we go to the AMD CBS menu, and then we go to Custom Core P States. We set that to custom. And then the P state vid, we just set that to 19. Well, in this case, 19, which 19 should give us around 1.24 volts. And so the vid works a bit weird. If you want to raise the voltage, you actually want to lower this value. So like 17 will be about 12.5 millivolts more than 19. So if I wanted to set like 1.3 volts, we would probably need like 14, I think. No, more like 12. But we don't want 1.3 volts, because at 1.3 volts in Cinebench, the 5950X gets insanely hot. Even with the 280 millimeter AIO, it gets insanely hot. So we're not going to do that. We're going to go with 19 here. Actually, no, we're going to go with 18, because I tested this in the past on 18, so we're going to do this with 18. And we're back in the operating system, so let's get Cinebench opened up and hardware info. So as you can see, if I'm just moving the mouse around, we still have boost active. Let's drag a window around for a bit. No? You're not gonna be silly? I'm gonna crank up the refresh rate on the sensors so that... Yeah, okay, so there we have like a 4.9. And I wanted a 5 gigahertz. Give me 5. Come on. Give me a 5 gigahertz boost. It's just not going to do it on video right now, is it? Okay, well, so you can see, like, the boost system is still active, right? Like, we have those blips to those very, very high frequencies, which is kind of the whole point of the boost system. And actually, you know, if I run, like, a lower core count workload, say, like, 4 cores, that'll actually run at... at like 4.6 gigahertz, right? Like we have these two cores at 4.6, 4.65, 4.65, and then another 4.65 right there. And so that's the boost system still working perfect, like as it normally does. That's sort of the whole point of the active OC tuner, is that you get to keep that behavior. And then if we run 32 thread Cinebench, we actually end up at 4.65 on the first CCD, 4.55 on the second CCD. Now our temperatures are a bit higher than the you know, automatic system, and also our refresh rate in hardware info right now is insanely high, so that's probably going to drag the score down a bit, because it's updating every 50 milliseconds, and you know, when the sensor readings are getting updated, Cinebench is obviously not able to run properly, so we're going to slow that right back down to 500 milliseconds, because yeah, that is actually really low. This overclock should be producing about 11,900 points, not 11,600, so yeah, so now we have 4.65 and 4.55 on our two CCDs. And we get 11,926 points. So 526 points more than if we just ran PBO, which conveniently matches that roughly 5% performance increase that Gigabyte has listed on their website. So you gotta give them credit for being honest, because like 5% is not a big number as far as I'm concerned, right? Like if we multiply this by 1.05, you know, yeah. We're almost exactly at that 5%. Like, in fact, we're a bit below that, but depending on your CPU, you might be able to get better results, or depending on your CPU and cooling system, you might be able to get better results than this. Yeah, I'm getting about 4.6% improvement. And so, yeah, Gigabyte's statement about this being worth like 5% is very accurate, because I've tried to push this further, it's just going to crash. Yeah, so that's how you use the active OC tuner. You just, like, we're actually going to go back into the, well, no, before we go back into the BIOS, we're going to go over it again one more time, but, yeah, so that's what the active OC tuner allows you to do. Now the bad news. So the bad news is, this is basically a static overclock that kicks in for high current workloads, right? So the thing is, Cinebench is not exactly heavy. It's not heavy. Like, there's a lot of people, you know, think they can use Cinebench as a stress test. You really can't. You shouldn't. And the problem with this is, so if you set up your active OC tuner and you dial it in on a benchmark like Cinebench, right, which is what I've basically done here, is like I've pre-tested those settings that I punched in to make sure that they would work for Cinebench, and well, they're not going to work for things that are heavier than Cinebench, and things that are heavier than Cinebench are going to trigger them, because the trigger point is just based on the temperature, trigger point is just based on the current or the temperature, and, you know, so anything that pulls more than 100 amps is just going to hit the uh, active OC tuner, and is going to crash. Is what it's going to do. So, if we close Cinebench here and I run small FFTs, the CPU basically almost hits 100 degrees. We immediately get a bunch of threads crashing. Yeah, the problem with this is that this is exactly the same as if you did a static overclock in terms of how hard, if you are actually serious about running this 24/7, you pretty much need to validate this like you would validate a static overclock. And so that 5% performance gain that you get in something like, if I go PBO versus active OC tuner specifically for Cinebench, yeah, I can get 5% more performance than PBO in Cinebench. However, if I was trying to actually set up the active OC tuner so that it's stable across all, even very heavy workloads, well, PBO would actually run Cinebench faster. Because I can tell you from experience that Prime 95 on this 5950X is limited to around 4.4 gigahertz, which is pretty close to what PBO will actually run for Cinebench on its own. Now, when PBO runs something like Prime 95, it'll run at 4.2. So technically, yes, I can run Prime 95 faster than PBO does. But if you don't run a lot of workloads that are as heavy as Prime 95 on your system, that's not a performance gain you're going to really notice regularly, right? If you do a lot of very heavy, calculations on your system that are AVX accelerated, and so, your favorite benchmark is Y-Cruncher or something, then the active OC tuner, yeah, it'll beat PBO. For any workload that you choose, you can dial in the active OC tuner to beat PBO. The problem is, if you start testing it against actual stress tests, you end up at settings that just aren't really that impressive, and you probably want to set the current triggering point so high that in your day-to-day usage, if you're not doing a lot of heavy stuff, it's probably never going to trigger. So that's kind of the thing, is it works. It's kind of neat. It's also really niche, in my opinion. I'm trying, because it's a static overclock, and so it has all of the it still has all the same downsides there, because, yeah, and you might be like, oh, you can set the temperature limit low. I tried that. It does not work like that. Or if it is supposed to work like that, that doesn't currently work like that. So yeah, it's great for maxing out the Cinebench score. This, it looks impressive, but if you consider the fact that actually this isn't stable for Prime 95, not really that great. And now there are some people who are perfectly happy to run systems that'll instantly crash trying to run something like Prime 95. I'm not one of them. So yeah, the fact that yeah, so the usefulness of this to me is pretty limited. But I guess maybe on a lower core count CPU, if you had a 5800X or a 5600X, this might be more useful. Because on those CPUs, you're not really... Because the main problem with the 5950X is the heat output. This thing gets insanely hot. And if you had, a 5900X, which has, a lot more silicon that's just not enabled, because that's a 12-core using, 8-core, that has 6 out of 8 cores on each CCD, and the 5600X as well, which also runs, actually the 5600X just runs really cool in general. If you have one of the cooler running CPUs, this could actually be a lot more useful, but on the 5950X, it's just it gets so hot that, yeah, if you're gonna dial this in for, 24/7 operation, you're probably going to end up at frequencies that are so low that you might as well just kind of leave PBO to do everything, unless you regularly run something as heavy as Prime 95, as LinPack, as Y-Cruncher, right? And those are real workloads. Like, those are things people do. It's just they're not very common. So, yeah. That's the active OC tuner. And then you just go over here, right? And you just change the vid. You don't have to worry about the frequency, as you can see. Like, I just left it on whatever it defaults to. So, yeah, because if I load optimize defaults, that's not like a leftover setting from some previous configuration that I was running. Like, that's just the default P state 0 on the CPU. Oh, actually, that didn't clear properly. It's still at 18. I should have cleared CMOS, I guess, but anyway. All right, that doesn't work. Yeah, but if you want to raise the voltage when using the active OC tuner, like, you would go, say, 14, and that's going to give you more voltage than 18. Then, like, 20 gives you less voltage. And there is an equation for calculating this, but I can't remember how it works right now. So that's kind of the, like, if you're wondering why I haven't told you, like, oh yeah, there's this formula for calculating what voltage you're going to end up with, there is a formula. I don't remember how it works, and I don't remember it, so that's why I haven't, like, given it to you. Yeah, so that's the Gigabyte Active OC tuner. It's okay. Like it does what it says on the tin, right? Like, it allows you to switch between PBO and static overclocks. The problem I have with it is, like, would you actually want to do that? Like, is that actually what you want to be doing? Do you really want to be switching over from PBO to a static overclock for maybe a 5% gain in your super heavy workloads? So, yeah, it might also be just like the CPU that I'm using it with. I feel like with this chip especially, it just doesn't really make that much sense to me to do this, but maybe with lower core count CPUs, this would be more useful. And the thing is, like, you can get this on the Pro AX, you can get this on the Master. So, like, if you have a board that has this feature, it's worth checking out, but I don't know that I would run out to buy a board just to get this, because even in, like, I feel like demonstrating this on Cinebench is kind of like a best case scenario, and it's still just 5%, right? Like, this isn't a feature where it's like, oh, you have to get a motherboard that has this, because it's just not that big. Like, it's not that big a difference. Now, I guess if I compared it against stock instead of PBO, it would actually look kind of impressive, but I feel like that's not very fair, okay? Like, comparing it against a bone stock 5950X is just, like, no. That's not a fair comparison, because they're really, like, with PBO, there's basically no risk. Like, I see absolutely no reason to not just enable just enable PBO and punch in, 333, 177, 177, or some other combination of limits, depending on what exactly you want, and then just, sort of calling it a day. So, yeah. Anyway, that's it for the video. Gigabyte's not going to be too thrilled about, my judgment of their new functionality. Especially because this is, like, a feature that Asus originally came out with, and I really wanted to test it there, but, like, now that I've actually gotten to use something like this, it's like, I mean, this is the thing that I expected it to do on the Asus motherboards, is just, like, it's not actually that useful. It sounds cool on paper, it looks really good if you run it on Cinebench, and then if you face the reality of, like, this is actually a static overclock, you need to test it like it's a static overclock, it's not that cool anymore, because it's a freaking static overclock, and you're, on the 5000 series. On 3000 series, there wasn't such a big gap in the heat output between something like Cinebench and Prime 95, but on 5000 series, man, AVX is so damn hot. So, yeah, neat feature, I guess. If you're bored, it's certainly worth trying out, but not not like I don't consider it like a killer feature that a motherboard has to have at this point, because it's just not that, like, it really doesn't do that much. So yeah. Anyway, that's it for the video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description below. There's also the HOC Teespring store where you can pick up shirts, stickers, posters, you know, the usual YouTuber merch. Both the Patreon and Teespring help out immensely with running the channel, so it would be much appreciated if you check them out. And yeah, that's it for the video. So thank you for watching, and goodbye.